Picture this: the heavy iron gates of a medieval castle slam shut, sealing you inside with hundreds of other soldiers. Outside, an enemy force stretches as far as the eye can see, their campfires flickering like stars in the night. The air is thick with tension, and you know this isn't going to be a quick battle. This is a siege, a waiting game where time itself becomes the enemy. What was it really like to live through months, or even years, trapped behind those walls, cut off from the world, with dwindling supplies and the constant threat of attack? Today, we're stepping into the shoes of those medieval soldiers, uncovering the gritty, often overlooked details of their daily lives during prolonged sieges. This isn't just about battles and bravery. It's about survival in its rawest form, where every meal, every moment of rest, and every whispered conversation could mean the difference between life and death. Think about the sheer willpower it took to endure, food stocks slowly vanishing, leaving soldiers to ration moldy bread and thin broth, water sources poisoned or cut off, forcing desperate measures to stay hydrated. The relentless boredom, broken only by the occasional clash of arrows or the distant taunts of the enemy. And then there's the psychological toll, the creeping fear that tomorrow might bring starvation, disease, or a breach in the walls. Yet amid all this, these soldiers found ways to keep going. They forged routines, clung to camaraderie, and even devised clever tricks to outwit their besiegers. Their stories are a testament to human resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, ingenuity and determination can shine through. But sieges weren't just about endurance, they were also battles of wits. Commanders had to outthink their opponents, using everything from deception to psychological warfare. Imagine the tension of a fake retreat, where defenders pretended to weaken, only to lure the enemy into a deadly trap. Or the daring midnight raids to steal supplies, where a single misstep could spell disaster. And then there were the silent killers, disease and despair, that often claimed more lives than swords or arrows. By the end of this video, you'll see sieges in a whole new light, not just as historical events but as human dramas, filled with struggle, sacrifice, and sometimes against all odds triumph. So let's pull back the curtain on these forgotten moments and discover what it truly meant to live behind the walls. The fortress walls may have seemed impenetrable, but no castle was truly unconquerable. Sieges were meticulously planned operations where attackers employed every trick in their arsenal to break the defender's will. Picture teams of sappers digging tunnels beneath the walls, working in darkness to weaken the foundations. One well-placed fire could collapse entire sections, creating a deadly breach. Meanwhile, trebuchets hurled not just stones but rotting animal carcasses over the walls, spreading disease among the tightly packed defenders. Psychological warfare played just as crucial a role as physical force. Attackers might launch flaming arrows after midnight to disrupt sleep, or parade captured comrades in view of the walls to crush morale. For those inside, survival depended on meticulous preparation. Commanders stockpiled grain in deep cellars and diverted hidden springs to secure water sources, knowing a single contaminated well could doom them. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly to repair armor and weapons, while fletchers crafted arrows by the thousands, each one a small hope against the encroaching enemy. But even the best defenses had weak points. The castle's weakest link wasn't its walls but its people. A starving soldier might sneak out to surrender, or a disgruntled servant could open a postern gate for gold. That's why trust was as vital as rations. Guards rotated in pairs to watch each other, and commanders spread rumors of imaginary stockpiles to maintain hope. What made sieges uniquely terrifying was their unpredictability. unlike open battles that ended in hours, sieges dragged on for months, with waves of false hope and crushing setbacks. One week, a relief army might appear on the horizon only to retreat after skirmishing. The next, a sudden storm could flood the attackers' camps, offering a brief reprieve. Soldiers lived in this limbo, where news traveled slowly and rumors spread like wildfire. Every creak of the gates, every shout from the walls sent hearts racing. Was this the long-awaited rescue, or the beginning of the final assault? That constant tension, more than hunger or fatigue, wore down even the hardiest warriors. The reality of hunger inside a besieged fortress was far worse than most modern minds could comprehend. As weeks turned into months, soldiers watched their daily rations shrink from hearty portions to thin slivers of mold-speckled bread, if they were lucky. The castle's granaries, once bursting with grain, echoed hollowly as cooks scraped the last dusty remnants from wooden barrels. Salted meat, preserved for emergencies, became stringy and foul-tasting, but every scrap was devoured. Even the castle's livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, vanished one by one into the cooking pots until only bones remained. Desperation bred creativity. Soldiers trapped in the siege of Folklore in 1415 reportedly boiled leather belts and parchment just to extract trace nutrients. Water became even more precious than food. Besiegers knew that poisoning wells or diverting streams could break a garrison faster than any battering ram. Defenders dug frantically for groundwater, but many wells ran dry or turned brackish. In the stifling heat of summer, men licked condensation from cold stone walls or strained muddy puddles through cloth just to wet their cracked lips. Some castles stored rainwater in vast underground cisterns, but without proper filtration, dysentery could rip through the ranks. That's why many commanders ordered weak beer brewed, not for merriment but survival. The fermentation process killed bacteria, making it safer than stagnant water, though it left soldiers groggy and dehydrated. The slow grind of malnutrition changed bodies and minds alike. Soldiers who once trained daily with heavy swords now struggled to lift them. Night blindness from vitamin deficiencies made sentries useless after dusk. Teeth loosened from scurvy, and wounds that should have healed festered instead. But perhaps the cruelest effect was the way hunger warped judgment. Friends turned suspicious, hoarding crumbs beneath their bedrolls. In the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, chroniclers wrote of men gnawing on their own fingertips, not from madness but from sheer gnawing instinct. Yet even in these direst moments, human ingenuity flickered like a candle in the dark. Cooks stretched single sacks of grain by mixing in sawdust or ground acorns. Hunters snuck through hidden postern gates to trap rabbits or net pigeons under cover of fog. Some castles even cultivated hidden gardens within their inner wards, growing quick sprouting greens between the cobblestones. And when all else failed, defenders turned to the oldest siege trick of all, illusion. Commanders might order empty grain sacks stacked conspicuously on the walls, or have the last fattened ox paraded around the battlements daily, each time with a different painted marking to convince spies their supplies were plentiful. These small deceptions bought time, and in a siege, time was the one ration no one could afford to waste. Disease lurked in every shadow of a besieged fortress, an invisible enemy far deadlier than any armored knight. While arrows and siege engines posed obvious threats, it was the silent spread of sickness that truly hollowed out a garrison. Picture hundreds of men crammed into tight barracks, their bodies weakened by hunger, sharing the same stale air day after day. With no sewage systems, waste piled up in reeking trenches or seeped into the castle's lower levels, contaminating everything it touched. Flies swarmed over latrines left uncovered, then landed on half-eaten rations, carrying death from one man's bowl to another. Dysentery struck first, its brutal grip leaving soldiers too weak to stand guard. Then came typhus, carried by lice that thrived in unwashed woolen tunics and straw mattresses. And if the plague somehow breached the walls through a smuggled bundle of cloth or a fleeing refugee, it could wipe out half the defenders in weeks. Medical knowledge offered little defense. Castle surgeons, though skilled at setting broken bones or stitching wounds, were powerless against rampant infection. Their tools, rusty saws for amputations, heated irons to cauterize, often caused more harm than the original injury. Herbal remedies like crushed garlic or moldy bread poultices might ease a fever temporarily, but without understanding germs, even the most well-meaning healer couldn't stop the cycle of contagion. Some commanders ordered vinegar washes for wounds or quarantined the visibly ill, yet these measures barely slowed the tide. The stench of rotting flesh and unwashed bodies clung to the stone walls, a constant reminder that every cough or feverish sweat could herald another life lost. Hygiene became a desperate battleground. Without clean water for washing, soldiers rubbed themselves with sand or ashes to scrape away grime. The luckiest castles had underground springs for occasional baths, but most relied on communal troughs where men splashed their faces with the same fouled water. Clothing, stiff with sweat and blood, was rarely changed. Lice nests thrived in the seams. Some garrisons burned the bedding of the dead, while others resorted to hanging herbs like rosemary or juniper to mask the smells. But no amount of effort could fully ward off the inevitable. After months under siege, even the strongest fortresses resembled infirmaries, their halls echoing with the moans of the dying. Yet in this grim reality, small innovations sometimes made the difference between collapse and survival. Clever commanders rotated troops through fresher air in the towers, away from the disease-ridden courtyards. They enforced strict latrine digging far from water sources, however unpopular the chore. In cracked des Chevaliers during the 1200s, defenders mixed quicklime into waste pits to slow contamination. Others scattered vinegar-soaked rushes on floors to deter fleas. These weren't miracles, just fragile barriers against an unrelenting foe. For every soldier who fell to an enemy arrow, 3 more succumbed to fever or flux, their names forgotten by history. Disease didn't just weaken garrisons, it gnawed at hope itself, turning brotherhood into suspicion as men avoided their coughing comrades. In the end, many castles surrendered not because their walls failed, but because their defenders could no longer lift a sword or bear the sound of one more death rattle in the night. Commanders in a besieged fortress didn't just lead, they performed a desperate tightrope walk between hope and harsh reality. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and hesitation could doom the entire garrison. Take rationing, for example. A fair-minded leader might divide the last sacks of grain equally, only to watch his men grow too weak to hold swords. A pragmatic one would slash rations early, reserving food for the strongest fighters, knowing full well the sick and wounded would perish. There was no right answer, only survival calculus. Chroniclers recount how commanders like Edward the Black Prince during the siege of Limoges in 1370 ordered bread baked with sawdust to stretch supplies, while others secretly stockpiled reserves for a final stand. Discipline was equally brutal but necessary. Desertion wasn't just cowardice, it risked revealing hidden escape routes or weakening the defense at a critical moment. Punishments ranged from floggings to executions, often carried out publicly as grim reminders of the stakes. Yet the best leaders balanced fear with inspiration. At Malta in 1565, Jean de Valette moved among his men daily, sharing their hunger and mending their wounds with his own hands. soldiers fought harder for commanders who suffered alongside them, a lesson lost on those who ruled from cushioned chambers. Deception was another weapon in their arsenal. Clever leaders staged elaborate ruses, like the defenders of Kaffa in the 1300s, who catapulted their dead over the walls to spread disease among besiegers. Others, like the Welsh at Harlech Castle, lit extra fires at night to simulate a well-fed garrison while their men gnawed on boiled leather. Negotiation skills mattered too. Commanders haggled with spies, trading misinformation for scraps of enemy plans, or brokered secret deals with mercenaries for delayed attacks. The Siege of Orleans famously turned when Joan of Arc exploited the English commander's indecision, proving that psychological warfare could shatter even the most disciplined foes. But leadership under siege wasn't just about tactics, it was about endurance of the spirit. When supplies ran out and disease raged, soldiers looked to their commanders for more than orders. They needed the unshakable belief that the next sunrise was worth fighting for. Some leaders cultivated this through rituals, daily musters to count the living, or sermons reminding men of past victories. Others, like the defiant governor of Shajdvar in 1566, Miklos Zeriny, staged final feasts with empty plates, vowing to die free rather than kneel. In the end, a commander's true test wasn't just keeping bodies alive, but keeping hope from crumbling faster than the walls. Discipline inside a besieged fortress walked a razor's edge. Too lax and order crumbled, too cruel and morale snapped. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were grim theater. A deserter hanged from the battlements sent a clear message: betrayal had consequences. Chroniclers recount how garrisons in the 100 Years' War would force condemned men to dig their own graves before dawn, the shovel's scrape echoing as a warning to others. Yet even in this harsh world, fairness mattered. Commanders knew arbitrary brutality bred resentment, so trials, however swift, were held. A soldier caught stealing bread might lose a hand, but if he'd done it to feed a dying comrade, the penalty could be lighter. Justice had to feel just, or the ranks would splinter. Guarding the guards was another challenge. Sentries paired up not just for safety, but to watch each other. In the siege of Constantinople, defenders used a clever trick, changing patrol routes nightly and whispering the day's password only at the last moment. Spies lurked everywhere, some loyal, others bribed with promises of food or freedom. The Knights Hospitaller in Rhodes kept a network of informants among the cooks and stable boys, knowing a muttered complaint today could spark a mutiny tomorrow. But suspicion alone couldn't sustain an army. That's why wise commanders balanced the stick with the carrot. A shared cask of wine after a successful sortie, or extra rations for the watchmen on freezing nights, reminded men that loyalty had rewards. Amidst the dread, camaraderie became a lifeline. Soldiers clustered around smoky fires, swapping stories of home or inventing crude board games scratched into stone. Dice carved from bone rattled in the dark, the stakes not gold but precious slivers of cheese or sips of ale. In the siege of Harfleur, men reportedly held mock tournaments with blunted weapons, turning agony into spectacle. These moments weren't frivolous, they stitched the garrison together. A shared joke during a bombardment, a helping hand to a limping comrade. These tiny acts forged bonds stronger than iron. The true genius of siege leadership lay in this duality. Fear kept men in line, but fellowship kept them human. When the walls shook under cannon fire, it wasn't the threat of the noose that made a soldier stand his ground. It was the man beside him, grumbling through clenched teeth as he knocked another arrow. That delicate balance between terror and trust turned a starving mob into a brotherhood. And sometimes, against all odds, that brotherhood held the line just long enough for relief to come, or for the enemy to lose heart first. Psychological warfare turned the very air thick with dread, an invisible siege engine more crushing than any catapult. Imagine standing on the battlements at dawn, only to see the enemy tossing the heads of fallen comrades over the walls, a grotesque message that surrender was the only mercy left. Besiegers' new terror worked better than steel. They'd taunt defenders by roasting meat just beyond arrow range, the aroma of sizzling pork torturing hungry men who hadn't tasted fresh meat in months. At Chateau de Coucy in 1415, attackers even staged mock tournaments outside the walls, their laughter carrying on the wind as if war were a game. Inside the fortress, despair slithered into every corner. Sleep-deprived sentries began seeing phantoms in the fog, shadows they swore were scaling the walls, or the ghosts of dead friends whispering warnings. Some soldiers, pushed to the edge, would suddenly laugh hysterically during attacks or strip off their armor, convinced they were invincible. The siege of Neuss in 1474 saw men gnawing at their own fingers, not from hunger but delirium. Commanders fought this decay with every tool they had. Chaplains held masses at all hours, their voices rising above the din to promise divine deliverance. Clever officers spread rumors whispering that a relief force was just 3 days away or that the enemy's food supplies had burned. These lies weren't cruelty, they were lifelines. The mine's unraveling could doom a garrison faster than any battering ram. That's why the smartest defenders turned the tables. During the siege of Malta, knights hurled insults in rhyming verse, mocking the Ottoman commanders' failed tactics until fury clouded their judgment. At Stirling Castle, Scots dangled empty armor from the walls, making their numbers seem endless. Every cheer from the battlements, every defiant song sung at midnight was a weapon proof that spirits hadn't broken. Because in the end, a siege wasn't just a test of strength but of stubbornness. The side that blinked first lost, and then there were the hours between horrors, long stretches where nothing happened at all. Boredom became its own enemy, a creeping malaise that dulled reflexes and sapped vigilance. Soldiers played dice with carved knucklebones, betting stale crusts of bread. Others sharpened the same dagger for the 100th time, just to keep their hands busy. Some garrisons staged absurd contests who could balance a helmet on their nose longest, or recite the most verses of bawdy poetry. These weren't distractions, they were survival tactics. A man fixated on winning a joke tournament wasn't brooding over empty bellies or the stench of the latrines. In the suffocating monotony of siege life, laughter was as vital as a whetstone. It kept the mind's blade sharp for when the real battle came. Yet even amid the grimness, sparks of humanity endured. A Welsh chronicle from the siege of Harlech tells of soldiers passing around a single wooden flute, each man adding a note to an endless, improvised tune. In the silence between assaults, that fragile melody wove through the castle like a promise that as long as someone could still breathe, they could still make music. And perhaps that was the greatest defiance of all. Between the terror of assaults and the gnawing ache of hunger, boredom became its own relentless foe inside the fortress walls. Days blurred into weeks with no enemy charge to break the monotony, just the endless cycle of watch duty, ration checks, and the same grim faces. Soldiers learned to fight idleness as fiercely as any invader. Blades that had cleaved armor in battle now met whetstones for hours, edges honed to impossible sharpness not out of necessity, but for something to do. Armor needed constant attention, mail rings re-knitted by calloused fingers, dents hammered from breastplates until they gleamed like mirrors. These weren't just chores, they were rituals, ways to keep hands busy and minds from unraveling. Gambling dens sprang up in shadowed corners, dice carved from goat bones clattering across barrel lids. Steaks were meager, an extra spoonful of porridge, a turn at the warmest sleeping spot, but the games drew crowds. More than winning, it was the thrill of chance that hooked them, the fleeting illusion that luck hadn't abandoned them entirely. Storytellers became prized commodities, their tales stretching into the night. A soldier who'd fought in the Holy Land might describe the scent of Cypriot wine, or the way desert stars outshone any in Europe. Others spun bawdy yarns of tavern brawls and mythical lovers, anything to summon laughter in the dark. Music flickered through the fortress like candlelight. A dented flute traded hands in the barracks, each player adding notes to a melody that grew stranger with every fevered iteration. Lyrics turned into inside jokes, ballads about the enemy commander's comically large nose, or odes to the last turnip in the storeroom. These weren't just songs, they were acts of rebellion, proof that joy hadn't been suffocated yet. Some men scribbled in makeshift diaries, not chronicles of war but of tiny victories. A bird nesting in the armory, the day the cooks found forgotten honey in a cracked jar. Games took on absurd proportions. One garrison held a tournament where archers shot at a painted caricature of the besieging general. Another staged wrestling matches in the courtyard. The winner awarded a helmet full of sour wine. These weren't distractions, they were lifelines, ways to remember how it felt to be human. Because the cruelest trick of a prolonged siege wasn't the hunger or the fear. It was the way time stretched like tar, making every second without action feel like surrender. So they carved chessboards into tabletops, staged shadow puppet plays with stolen candles, anything to outwit the silence. And then there were the quiet moments when men simply sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the sunset paint the enemy camp in gold. No words, no games, just the shared understanding that today, at least, they were still alive. That was the real secret. Boredom couldn't kill them, but letting it in could. So they sharpened their blades one more time, rolled the dice again, hummed the chorus louder. Because as long as they were doing something, anything, the siege hadn't won. The fortress walls may have been manned by soldiers, but the true heartbeat of a besieged castle often came from those history books too often forget. The women who endured every hardship alongside the men. Far from passive bystanders, these women were the unseen glue holding fractured garrisons together. Wives who'd followed their husbands to war now tore their own dresses for bandages, their hands slick with blood as they staunched wounds in torchlit cellars. Cooks stretched handfuls of grain into watery gruel, scouring the courtyards for dandelions or nettles to toss into the pot. Even prostitutes, dismissed by chroniclers as mere camp followers, risked their lives carrying messages between battlements when male runners were cut down by arrows. Their presence was a paradox, every mouth to feed strained dwindling supplies, yet their labor mending armor, grinding flour, hauling water, kept the fortress functioning long after logic said it should have fallen. Some women stepped directly into the fray, their deeds blurred between fact and legend. At the siege of Chateau de Montségur, women allegedly hurled stones from the ramparts when arrows ran out. In 1589, the Spanish defenders of Avila credited a nun with rallying troops by parading a crucifix along the battlements under fire. But the most enduring tales involve boiling oil, like the apocryphal story of a butcher's wife in Neuse who tipped a cauldron onto scaling ladders, sending enemy soldiers screaming into the moat. Whether strictly true or not, these stories mattered. They gave defenders something to emulate, proof that courage wasn't bound by gender. Yet life for these women was a relentless tightrope walk. A pregnant woman giving birth in a disease-ridden cellar had no midwife, only battle-numbed soldiers to assist. Young girls married off to garrison troops for protection became widows before their 17th birthdays. And when a fortress finally fell, their fates were especially grim: enslavement, assault, or being bartered as spoils of war. That's why some took desperate measures. During the Siege of Lyon in 1593, women reportedly disguised themselves as corpses to escape in burial carts. Others, like the Welsh noblewoman Gwenllian Furch Griffith, led guerrilla raids from hidden tunnels, proving that the line between defender and leader could vanish in the smoke of battle. What makes their stories so vital isn't just heroism, but the raw humanity they reveal. A soldier might endure for duty or coin, but a woman grinding acorns into flour did it for the child clinging to her skirt. When a cook smuggled an extra ladle of broth to a feverish sentry, it wasn't strategy, it was compassion keeping the machine of war from grinding souls into dust. These moments, small and unrecorded, were the true counterweight to despair, because in the end, a siege wasn't just broken by swords, but by the stubborn will of those who refused to let the light go out, whether they held a weapon or a stirring spoon. When death loomed at every arrow slit and starvation gnawed at the belly, faith became as essential as a sword. Chaplains moved through the fortress like shadows, their voices rising above the clatter of armor to deliver prayers for deliverance. In the siege of Jerusalem during the 11th century, defenders clutched fragments of the true cross, believing divine favor could turn enemy spears. Every Sunday, even as the enemy's trebuchets hurled stones, Mass was held in the chapel, its stained glass shattered, its altar draped with a blood-stained cloak. Soldiers knelt on cold stone, not just out of piety, but because in the face of certain doom, ritual was the last thread of normalcy they could grasp. Superstition seeped into every crack of the fortress walls, blending with formal religion in ways that would shock modern clerics. A raven circling the keep at dawn wasn't just a bird, it was an omen, its flight path debated by men who'd otherwise scoff at folklore. Astrology charts were scrawled on parchment, consulted before sorties. One chronicle from the Siege of Rouen describes a knight who refused to fight on a Tuesday, convinced the alignment of Mars doomed any battle that day. Charms abounded, a dried fox's paw tucked into a boot for luck, a verse from Psalms sewn into a tunic to ward off arrows. Even commanders indulged these beliefs, knowing that a soldier who thought himself protected by magic fought harder. Yet faith was a double-edged sword. In multicultural garrisons where Christians, Muslims, and Jews might be forced into uneasy alliance, religious tension simmered beneath the surface. During the Siege of Acre, Latin and Greek Christians nearly came to blows over whose liturgy should be chanted during a desperate midnight service. In Spanish castles, where converted Muslims Moriscos fought alongside old Crusader families, whispered accusations of secret prayers to Allah could spark violence. Chaplains sometimes stoked these divisions, warning that God would abandon them if heretics weren't expelled, even if those heretics were the best archers on the walls. The most fascinating clashes weren't between faiths, but between faith and desperation. When prayers for rain went unanswered, soldiers might sneak out to dig up pagan standing stones, rubbing them like talismans. A garrison in Wales during the 12th century reportedly resorted to druidic rites, sacrificing a horse to deities their grandparents had forgotten. Later, they confessed it to a priest who absolved them, knowing starvation had eroded their sense of sin. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was human nature. Fear made theologians of everyone, and the divine was whatever kept you standing when the walls shook. In the end, religion's greatest gift wasn't victory, but meaning. A dying soldier clutching a rosary didn't believe the beads would save his body, only that they might save his soul. Nightly vespers gave structure to chaos, a reminder that somewhere beyond the smoke, a world still turned under God's gaze. And when the final assault came, it wasn't just swordsmen who rallied on the walls. It was chaplains with uplifted crucifixes, imams calling the takbir, rabbis reciting the Shema. Their voices rose together, not in harmony but in defiance. because whether heaven answered or not, the act of crying out was itself a kind of armor. Silence could kill as surely as a sword, which is why communication with the outside world became a lifeline woven from desperation and cunning. Picture a lone runner, barefoot and wrapped in rags, slithering through a sewer grate under cover of darkness. His pockets hold scraps of parchment, each word written in code. 12 barrels grain spoiled, south wall weak, send word before new moon. One snapped twig, one misplaced step, and he'd face the enemy's interrogation, fingers broken, nails pulled, until he revealed every secret path into the fortress. Yet runners kept going because the alternative was watching their comrades starve in ignorance. For longer distances, carrier pigeons became feathered couriers of hope. Tied to their legs were tiny scrolls, often written in cipher or invisible ink. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 saw birds outwit entire armies, their wings cutting through skies thick with arrows. But pigeons were fickle allies. Storms could blow them off course, hawks picked them from the air, and a single well-aimed shot from a bored sentry could doom an entire garrison's plea for help. That's why commanders sent the same message by multiple birds, hoping at least one would dodge the odds. The most dangerous game, though, was played by spies. These weren't dashing agents in disguise, but beggars, merchants, even children, people whose faces wouldn't draw a second glance. A woman selling eggs might slip a coded note beneath her basket's false bottom. A captured soldier, escaping back to the fortress, could be a Trojan horse, his head full of enemy lies. At the Siege of Tyre in 1187, a leper colony's daily shuffle past enemy lines became the perfect cover for whispered intelligence. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. A single misjudgment, like the betrayal at Château de Falaise, where a trusted squire led attackers through a postern gate, could collapse months of resistance in an hour. Misinformation was the shadow twin of truth, and both sides wielded it ruthlessly. Defenders might let a deserter be captured, his pockets stuffed with fake plans suggesting the garrison had enough food for a year. Besiegers, in turn, floated rumors of approaching relief armies that didn't exist, tricking defenders into wasteful sorties. The Siege of Constantinople saw the Byzantines fly lanterns at night in complex patterns, fooling the Ottomans into believing secret signals were being exchanged with allies. In this deadly theater, every whispered word, every fluttering scrap of parchment was a weapon. And then came the final, terrible calculus, when messengers stopped returning, when pigeons circled back with scrolls untouched, and the walls echoed with the enemy's drumbeats growing louder. That silence screamed the truth. No help was coming. Now, the only messages that mattered were the ones scrawled on arrows shot into the courtyard: surrender by dawn or no quarter given. The time for words had ended. The time for blood had come. The final days of a siege carried a peculiar weight, less like the frenzied climax of battle, and more like the slow, suffocating squeeze of a closing fist. As food stores dwindled to dust and the last drops of ale vanished, defenders faced a grim calculus. Every action now was preparation for an ending they could no longer avoid. Reinforcements weren't coming. Negotiations had failed. All that remained was the narrowing of options, the sharpening of purpose. You'd see it in the way men moved, no longer the sluggish shuffle of hunger, but a deliberate, almost ritualistic intensity. Every weak point in the walls was shored up with rubble and timber, every loose stone mortared over in frantic haste. Blacksmiths, their forges glowing day and night, hammered shattered swords into daggers, broken hinges into arrowheads. Even the castle's bells weren't spared. Their bronze melted down for makeshift axe blades, because when the end came, there'd be no need to sound alarms anymore. Close quarters combat became the obsession of those final hours. veterans drilled weary garrisons in the brutal dance of hallway, fighting how to use a shield as a battering ram, how to pivot in tight spaces where a longsword was worse than useless. Men practiced with whatever they had: butchers' cleavers, fire pokers, even the iron-bound staves of broken barrels. The goal wasn't elegance, it was economy. A single well-placed thrust to the throat could buy time for 3 others to strike. In the siege of Chateau-Gaillard, defenders reportedly greased the castle's inner staircases, forcing attackers to stumble into waiting spears. Desperation bred ingenuity, and every trick, no matter how crude, was another minute of life. Yet beneath the frenetic activity lurked an unspoken question, heavier than any armor. When the moment came, would they choose to die on their feet or kneel for mercy? Some commanders burned their own standards rather than let them be captured, while others quietly stockpiled valuables to barter for their men's lives. The tension manifested in strange ways. A soldier might suddenly gift his only blanket to a comrade, or another would recite his family's lineage to anyone who'd listen, as if ensuring someone would remember his name. Even the castle itself seemed to brace, its courtyards too quiet, its corridors echoing with the sound of blades being tested against stone. Then came the waiting. The eerie lull before the storm, when the enemy's drums fell silent and the night held its breath. Men slept in shifts, fully armored, their hands curled around weapons they no longer had the strength to lift properly. Sentries peered into the darkness, knowing the assault could come at any moment, perhaps as a feint at the main gate, while the real attack scaled the undefended chapel wall. And in those last brittle hours, the smallest things took on unbearable significance. The way the wind carried the scent of rain, or the way a single candle's glow caught the edge of a rusted helm. It wasn't fear that filled them then, but something far stranger, a clarity so sharp it cut through everything but the moment itself. Because when dawn finally broke and the ladders slammed against the walls, there'd be no more choices left. Only the one they'd already made, to stand and fight and make their ending mean something. The moment the gates creaked open under a white flag, the real reckoning began. Surrender wasn't an ending, it was a gamble where the stakes were life itself, and the terms depended on everything from the defender's valor to the besieger's mood. Picture a haggard commander, his tabard stained with soot and blood, stepping forward to kneel before the enemy general. His hands might offer a sword, a key, or a chest of coins, each gesture carrying unspoken meaning. A blade presented hilt first signaled respect, a plea for honorable terms. A key tossed at the victor's feet was defiance in defeat, a silent challenge to show mercy. And coins, that was pragmatism, the universal language of ransom. But mercy was fickle. Some commanders, like the legendary Saladin during the Crusades, became famed for their clemency, allowing defeated foes to march out with dignity. Others, like Edward I at Berwick, turned surrender into slaughter, making examples of entire garrisons to terrify future enemies. The difference often lay in politics. A fortress blocking a vital trade route might be spared to keep roads open, while a rebellious town could face brutal reprisals as a warning. Even the weather played a role. A storm brewing on the horizon might make besiegers lenient, eager to secure shelter before the skies broke. For the common soldier, surrender was a lottery. Knights and nobles could usually buy their freedom, their status making them valuable hostages, but the infantry. Their fate swung between grim extremes. Some were pressed into the victor's army, handed a spear and shoved toward the next siege. Others were stripped of armor and released, sent stumbling home as living proof of the enemy's generosity. The unluckiest found themselves enslaved, shipped off to rogue galleys or labor in foreign quarries. And then there were the executions, not always immediate, sometimes delayed for theatrical cruelty. After the fall of Acre in 1291, the Mamluk Sultan had defenders march to a cliff's edge in batches, their deaths spaced over days to maximize terror. Yet surrender's specter shaped decisions long before the walls crumbled. Commanders weighed their men's lives against their honor, knowing some choices would echo through history. At Malta in 1565, the knights' refusal to capitulate even when their fortresses were rubble became legendary. But lesser-known garrisons often chose pragmatism over glory, trading their swords for safe passage. The cruelest irony, those who held out longest sometimes faced the worst fates, their stubbornness erasing any chance of mercy. And so, in those final hours before the breach, defenders whispered the same question: what awaits us on the other side of this gate? The answer, written in the faces of the enemy and the grudges of kings, was the last weight on every soldier's shoulders. Whether they walked free or fell to their knees in chains, surrender wasn't an act. It was the sum of every choice, every sacrifice, and every shred of hope that had brought them to that moment. And in the end, it wasn't the walls that defined them, but how they faced what came after. The grinding arms race of medieval siege warfare turned castles into laboratories of destruction and defiance. Attackers didn't just throw rocks at walls, they engineered them into oblivion. Take the trebuchet, a monstrous sling capable of hurling 300-pound stones with terrifying precision. At the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward Longshanks ordered his engineers to build Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive its shadow darkened the courtyard. But defenders weren't idle targets. They countered by constructing inner walls reduits behind vulnerable sections, forcing attackers to breach layer after layer under a rain of arrows. Every innovation sparked a brutal reply. When sappers tunneled beneath towers, garrisons dug countermines, leading to claustrophobic knife fights in pitch-black earth. Siege towers became rolling fortresses, their wooden frames draped with soaked hides to repel fire arrows. At Jerusalem's walls in 1099, Crusaders pushed towers taller than the battlements, only to find the defenders had secretly heightened their defenses at night. The real horror came when towers reached the walls, drawbridges slammed down, and armored knights surged onto the ramparts in a storm of steel. But defenders had their own nightmares to unleash. Boiling oil wasn't just theater, it seared through armor, melting flesh to bone. At Chateau-Gaillard, French soldiers mixed quicklime into boiling water, creating a viscous horror that clung to skin. Others dropped caltrops, spiked iron stars into assault paths, crippling horses and men alike. The most ingenious defenses were invisible until triggered. Murder holes in gatehouse ceilings dropped rocks or burning sand, the latter seeping into helmet visors, blinding attackers mid-charge. Some castles had pivoting floor planks that tipped invaders into pits. At Crac des Chevaliers, defenders channeled wastewater through hidden pipes, creating slippery death traps during assaults. Yet adaptability defined survival. When cannon emerged in the 1400s, garrisons packed walls with earth to absorb shots or angled masonry to deflect fire. The siege of Constantinople saw defenders stretch giant chains across the Golden Horn, thwarting Ottoman ships until the enemy hauled vessels overland on greased logs. For the common soldier, these technologies weren't abstractions. They dictated daily survival. Archers spent dawn till dusk fletching arrows, knowing each volley had to count. Blacksmiths hammered caltrops between repairing shattered armor. Even the lowliest squire had a role, hauling baskets of stones to the hoardings, the wooden galleries jutting from walls where defenders dropped missiles straight onto climbers. Every invention shifted the rhythm of the siege, turning yesterday's safety into tomorrow's death trap. And through it all, one truth endured. In the shadow of those towering walls, ingenuity was as lethal as any blade. The gates might have swung open, but for those who walked out alive, the siege never truly ended. Survivors carried invisible wounds deeper than any sword could cut. Picture a knight who once stood defiant on the ramparts, now flinching at the sound of a slamming door, his hands steady in battle but trembling at the memory of starvation's grip. Or the archer who could thread an arrow through a helmet slit, yet woke gasping from dreams of friends choking on poisoned well water. These weren't just soldiers, they were ghosts of themselves, haunted by what they'd endured and what they'd done to survive. For many, the only path forward was to sell the very skills that had kept them alive. Mercenary companies swelled with siege-hardened veterans, their expertise in tunneling or night raids now commodities for the highest bidder. A man who defended a fortress for months could dismantle one in weeks, his knowledge of weak points and rationing tactics invaluable to new employers. But this life came at a cost. The same hands that rebuilt villages for pay might burn them the next season under a different banner. Loyalty became a luxury few could afford when bread depended on switching sides. Others tried to return home only to find the world they'd left unrecognizable. Fields lay fallow, picked clean by passing armies. Families had scattered during the fighting, some never to be found. A chronicle from the 100 Years' War tells of a French soldier who walked for weeks to reach his village, only to discover his cottage reduced to charred timbers and his wife's name scratched onto a mass grave marker. Rebuilding required more than mortar and timber. It demanded a will to plant crops knowing they might be torched before harvest, or to love again when grief still clung like armor. The physical scars told only part of the story. A missing limb might earn pity, but the nightmares, the relentless replay of screams during a night assault, or the face of the boy you pushed aside for the last crust of bread, those were burdens carried alone. Some sought solace in religion, pilgrimaging to shrines to atone for sins real or imagined. Others drowned memories in ale, their coin spent on fleeting numbness rather than rebuilding. Communities struggled to reconcile with men who'd done terrible things to survive, their heroism now shadowed by rumors of what happened in the castle's darkest corners. Yet amid the wreckage, glimmers of resilience flickered. A blacksmith who'd reforged shattered swords during the siege might turn his hammer to plowshares, his workbench now a place of creation rather than repair. A cook who'd stretched handfuls of grain into meals for hundreds could open an inn, her recipes born of scarcity now nourishing travelers in peace. These small acts weren't just survival, they were rebellion. To plant a seed where walls once stood, to knead dough without counting each loaf as a day closer to doom, was to whisper to the past, "You didn't break me." The cruelest truth was this: the siege end wasn't a line in the sand, but a slow unfolding. It lived in the way a veteran's breath hitched at the smell of smoke, or how a mother hid extra bread beneath her bed long after the famine passed. It echoed in lullabies that skipped verses about knights and battles, and in taverns where old soldiers locked eyes across the room, their silence louder than any war chant. Survival wasn't an escape. It was a lifetime of carrying what couldn't be set down, and somehow, against all odds, they learned to bear the weight. From the snow-capped keeps of Scotland to the sun-baked ramparts of Syria, siege warfare shaped civilizations, yet the walls that divided them couldn't contain the shared nightmares of those trapped inside. European castles, with their concentric rings of stone, stood in stark contrast to the towering mud-brick citadels of the Middle East or the sprawling wooden fortresses of feudal Japan. But peel back those architectural differences, and you'd find soldiers on every continent counting ration crumbs by firelight, flinching at the same distant drumbeats. Take prisoner treatment, a mirror reflecting each culture's darkest ethics. In Europe, captured nobles often enjoyed comfortable captivity, their ransom value ensuring decent quarters while common soldiers rotted in pits. Contrast that with the Ottoman practice of devshirme, where young prisoners might be forcibly converted and trained as elite janissaries, a fate some preferred to execution. Meanwhile, in Ming China, surrendering garrisons faced ritual humiliation, stripped of armor and forced to crawl through the victor's gate, a psychological blow more lasting than chains. Yet beneath these variations pulsed the same brutal calculus. Prisoners were bargaining chips, labor sources, or propaganda tools, their fates dictated by cold necessity rather than mercy. The architecture of fear also transcended borders. European defenders dreaded the trebuchet's arc, while samurai behind wooden palisades feared fire arrows igniting their paper and timber walls. But the countermeasures revealed universal ingenuity. Crusader castles like Crac des Chevaliers built twisting entrance corridors to bottleneck attackers, an idea echoed in the zigzag gates of India's Mehrangarh fort. Mongolian siege crews tunneling beneath Chinese walls would find defenders digging countermines, just as Spanish sappers at Granada encountered boiling oil poured through murder holes identical to those in French castles. War's dialects differed, but its grammar remained the same. Perhaps the most haunting parallel was the descent into desperation. Whether in a Scottish tower house or a Persian fortress, starvation bred identical horrors. Japanese records from the Siege of Tottori in 1581 describe soldiers boiling bark and eating rats, mirroring accounts from the Siege of Paris 9 centuries earlier, where zoo animals became feasts. The same grim arithmetic played out everywhere. When dogs and horses vanished, boots and belts followed. A Byzantine chronicle recounts defenders drinking their own urine, while Aztec warriors under siege at Tenochtitlan reportedly licked dew from stones. Hunger, it seemed, erased all distinctions of rank and culture, reducing humanity to its most primal state. Yet in these darkest hours, cultural fault lines still flickered. European garrisons clung to chivalric ideals, sometimes allowing honorable single combat between champions to decide a siege outcome, a notion unthinkable to Ottoman commanders who valued collective discipline. In Japan, Bushido code demanded defenders ritually open their own bellies rather than surrender, while Indian Rajputs preferred johar, mass self-immolation, to avoid dishonor. Contrast that with the Mamluks, who saw survival as tactical wisdom, not cowardice. These choices weren't just personal, they were cultural scripts written in blood, dictating how men faced the abyss. What binds these stories isn't just suffering, but resilience. A Welsh longbowman drawing his last arrow and a Turkish janissary sharpening his killage shared the same heartbeat: the stubborn refusal to let the light go out. Whether praying to Christ, Allah, or ancestral spirits, they scratched names on walls, traded jokes in the trenches, and found beauty in a shared sunrise over enemy camps. Because when the siege dragged into its 100th day, it didn't matter whose flag flew above the keep, only that the man beside you still stood. That truth, more than any wall or weapon, is what echoes through the centuries. A soldier's gravest wound wasn't always the gash from a sword, it was the fever that followed, creeping through his veins like poison. Without antibiotics, even a shallow cut could turn lethal. Surgeons worked in dim-lit chambers, their tools little more than butcher's implements: iron saws for amputations, hot pokers to cauterize stumps, and crude needles threaded with horsehair to stitch torn flesh. Wine served as both antiseptic and anesthetic, poured liberally over wounds to clean them and down throats to dull the agony. The lucky ones passed out from pain or blood loss. The rest writhed against ropes tied to table legs, their screams muffled by leather straps or the occasional merciful swig of opium-laced syrup. Herbal remedies offered fleeting comfort rather than cures. Wound dressings might be packed with crushed garlic or honey, their antibacterial properties a fragile shield against infection. Willow bark tea eased fevers, while moldy bread poultices, unbeknownst to them, a primitive penicillin sometimes stalled gangrene. But these were gambles, not guarantees. A knight who survived a dozen battles could succumb to a single arrow's rust, his body burning up as the wound oozed greenish-black pus. The stench of rotting flesh hung thick in infirmaries, a grim counterpoint to the incense priests swung to mask it. Field surgery was a brutal ballet of speed and desperation. With enemy forces pounding at the gates, surgeons had minutes, not hours, to decide a limb's fate. A shattered leg, off at the knee before sepsis set in. A spear lodged in the abdomen. Prayers were more useful than probes. Some accounts speak of surgeons using live maggots to clean necrotic tissue, a grotesque but effective method that spared healthy flesh. Yet even the most skilled hands couldn't outpace trauma's toll. After the siege of Antioch, chroniclers described piles of amputated limbs, higher than the altar, a testament to both the volume of suffering and the grim efficiency required to manage it. What's often overlooked is the psychological toll on those who wielded the saws. These weren't unfeeling butchers. Many were monks or apprentices who'd trained under the era's scant medical texts. They knew their work was crude, that every incision risked killing rather than curing. Yet they pressed on because in the hellscape of a prolonged siege, even a 10% chance of survival was worth the cost. A soldier waking to find his arm gone might curse the surgeon, but days later, when his fever broke and the wound scabbed over, that same man might weep with gratitude. The true measure of these medical practices wasn't their success rate, but the fragile hope they represented. When a garrison's priest anointed a dying man's forehead with oil, it wasn't just a sacrament, it was a signal to the others that even in the face of certain death, someone still bore witness. And when a surgeon wiped his bloody hands on his apron and reached for the next patient, he wasn't just saving lives, he was proving that as long as one person fought to mend what war had broken, the siege hadn't won. Gold and grain were twin pillars of siege warfare, but while one could be stretched thin, the other often vanished entirely. A commander might promise his men mountains of loot, but without coin to grease the wheels of war, even the most loyal garrison could crumble from within. Consider the infamous siege of Naples in 1528, where Spanish troops, unpaid for months, staged a full-scale mutiny, abandoning their posts to ransack the countryside. Their desperation wasn't just about hunger, it was about betrayal. Many had signed on for a share of plunder, only to find their pay chests contained more cobwebs than silver. The financial strain of a siege radiated far beyond the battlefield. Kings and barons emptied treasuries to fund these grinding stalemates, sometimes pawning crown jewels or levying brutal taxes on already suffering peasants. The siege of Rouen in 1418 saw the English crown borrow staggering sums from Italian bankers, pledging future wool exports as collateral. But money flowed both ways. Besiegers often paid local farmers exorbitant prices for supplies, creating surreal black markets where starving defenders could glimpse wagons of fresh bread rolling into enemy camps, just out of reach. For the common soldier, unpaid wages weren't just an inconvenience, they were a death sentence. Without coin, a man couldn't bribe guards to smuggle in food, replace a rusted breastplate, or send word to his family. Mutinies rarely started with bloodthirsty rebellion. More often, they began with sullen whispers in the barracks, a growing realization that their lord's promises were as hollow as the granary barrels. The siege of Antwerp in 1585 saw entire companies defect after their paymaster absconded with the payroll, leaving men to choose between treason or starvation. Yet loot remained the siren song that kept soldiers fighting. Commanders dangled visions of sacked cities' silks, spices, and chests of Venetian ducats to justify months of misery. Some even issued plunder bonds, handwritten scraps promising specific shares of future spoils. But when victory finally came, reality rarely matched the fantasy. After the sack of Limoges in 1370, chronicler Jean Froissart wrote of English soldiers squabbling over a single golden chalice while their captains quietly hauled away the real wealth. The cruelest irony, sieges often bankrupted the victors too. A broken city yielded less loot than expected, its treasures hidden or destroyed by defenders. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining an occupying force could bleed a treasury dry. The siege of Harlem in 1573 cost the Spanish crown a fortune, only for the rebels to torch their own grain stores in defiance, leaving the conquerors with ashes and debt. In the end, the true measure of a siege success wasn't just who held the walls, but who could still afford to stand upon them. In the shadow of towering siege engines and crumbling walls, children navigated a world they should never have known, carrying water buckets heavier than themselves, darting through arrow fire to deliver messages, or holding trembling candles in dank cellars where the wounded moan. These weren't just boys playing at war, they were pages, squires, and orphans pressed into service, their small hands performing tasks too dangerous or demeaning for seasoned soldiers. A chronicle from the Siege of London in 1296 describes a boy of no more than 10 weaving through enemy lines with a note sewn into his tunic, his bare feet silent on the frostbitten ground. His reward, an extra crust of bread and the hollow praise of men who'd never risked their own necks so recklessly. Yet children brought something to the siege that hardened warriors couldn't: unexpected ingenuity. Their size let them slip through gaps in barricades or hide in storage barrels to eavesdrop on enemy plans. During the defense of Montségur, young girls disguised as beggars ferried intelligence between Cathar strongholds, their innocence disarming suspicious guards. But the most heartbreaking roles were symbolic. Commanders paraded orphaned children on the battlements, their clean faces and patched clothes a stark contrast to the grizzled soldiers, a visual plea to the besiegers' humanity. Did it work? Rarely, but in the Siege of Calais, the sight of starving children moved Queen Philippa to beg her husband for mercy, sparing 6 citizens from execution. War stripped these children of more than safety. It stole their very understanding of the world. A squire who'd spent his formative years scrubbing blood from chainmail might flinch at the sound of laughter, mistaking it for the shrieks of a dying comrade. Orphans who'd survived by looting the pockets of corpses would struggle to relearn kindness when peace came. Their trauma wasn't just physical, it was the quiet horror of a boy who'd forgotten his mother's face but could describe the gurgle of a stabbed man's last breath. Still, amid the darkness, flickers of resilience shone. Pages invented games to distract wounded men, rolling dice made from knucklebones across makeshift boards. In the Siege of Harfleur, a group of boys secretly nursed a wounded falcon back to health, its eventual flight over the walls becoming a fleeting symbol of hope. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were proof that even in the bleakest hours, childhood couldn't be entirely extinguished. Their legacy is a paradox, both a testament to survival and a condemnation of war's indiscriminate cruelty. Today, we might hang their tiny shoes in museums or etch their names on memorials, but the real monument is the question they force us to confront. How thin is the line between civilization and savagery when even the smallest must learn to kill or starve? The siege didn't just take their innocence, it revealed how quickly the world could demand they grow claws. And perhaps that's the most enduring wound of all, not what was done to them, but what they were forced to become. Horses were the first to go, not just because their meat could feed dozens, but because starving garrisons could no longer spare precious grain to keep them alive. These magnificent creatures, once the pride of any castle's stables, became walking larders. Knights who had ridden them into battle now turned away as butchers slit their throats, the animals' trusting eyes meeting their owners for one last moment. The meat was tough, stringy, and often diseased from malnutrition, but in a world where hunger gnawed at every belly, no one complained. Dogs followed soon after, their barks once a warning system now silenced by necessity. Even loyal hunting hounds bred for generations to serve noble families ended up in the stew pot, their collars repurposed as bowstrings or kindling. Cats, the unsung defenders of grain stores, lasted slightly longer. Their value as mousers bought them a few extra weeks, but when the rats themselves became a coveted protein source, the cat's fate was sealed. Chroniclers from the Siege of Paris in 885 wrote of soldiers trading cat pelts like currency, the fur used to patch gloves or line boots against the cold. But the real tragedy wasn't just the loss of meat, it was the erosion of companionship. Dogs that had slept at their master's feet, cats that curled in laps during long watches, even the stable horses whose familiar nickers had been a reminder of home, all gone. The castle grew quieter, not just in sound but in spirit, as the last threads of normalcy unraveled. Pigeons occupied a grim duality, lifelines and meals. These feathered messengers could slip through enemy lines when human runners couldn't, their wings carrying pleas for help or coded intelligence. But as starvation tightened its grip, commanders faced an impossible choice: send one more desperate plea for reinforcements, or feed the garrison for a day. Some tried to balance both, plucking a few birds for the pot while releasing others with trimmed messages to save weight. The siege of Kenilworth saw defenders so desperate they tied hollowed-out quills to sparrows, hoping the smaller birds would evade notice. It rarely worked. Without pigeons, garrisons were truly cut off, left to wonder if their pleas had been received, or if anyone cared enough to answer. Then came the rats. In normal times, their scurrying was a nuisance. Under siege, it became a hunt. Soldiers fashioned traps from broken arrowheads or lay motionless for hours, waiting to snatch one with bare hands. Rat meat was greasy and rank, but protein was protein. The siege of Antioch saw men trading recipes: roasted rat skewered on daggers, rat broth thickened with crushed acorns. But even vermin couldn't sustain a garrison forever. As their numbers dwindled, soldiers turned to insects, boiling beetles or grinding grasshoppers into bitter flour. The line between sustenance and survival blurred until the unthinkable became routine. The absence of animals left a void deeper than empty bellies. Without horses, no one could attempt a breakout or plow fields if relief came. Without dogs, night watchers grew eerily silent. Their keen ears missed more than their meat. And without pigeons, hope itself grew wings and flew away. In the end, the loss of these creatures marked the descent from hardship into true desperation, a world where even the smallest life had a price, and the last traces of mercy were measured in bones picked clean. The rhythmic pounding of a drum wasn't just noise, it was the pulse of defiance echoing through a besieged fortress. Minstrels didn't strum lutes for mere entertainment. Their ballads rewrote terror into legend, turning fresh defeats into tales of future victory. Picture a smoke-choked courtyard where soldiers, their faces gaunt from hunger, leaned on spears to listen as a bard sang of Roland at Roncesvalles or Arthur at Camlann. The stories weren't escapes from reality. They were blueprints for survival, proof that men outnumbered and outmatched could still etch their names into history. And when the bard's voice cracked from thirst, someone always handed him their last sip of ale, because in that moment, his song was worth more than water. But music's power wasn't just solace, it was strategy. Defenders chanted insults from the ramparts, their voices synchronized to drown out the enemy's threats. At the siege of Constantinople, Byzantine troops clashed their swords against shields in unison, creating a metallic roar meant to unnerve Ottoman sappers tunneling below. Drums became weapons of precision. 3 rapid beats might signal archers to loose volleys, while a steady cadence told sappers when to collapse their tunnels. Even silence was orchestrated. A sudden halt in drumbeats could lure attackers into thinking the garrison had faltered, only to spring an ambush. Then there were the nights when instruments replaced swords. A sentry's flute might thread through the darkness, its melody reaching the enemy's camp as a haunting reminder that behind these walls lived men, not faceless foes. During the siege of Harlech Castle, Welsh defenders reportedly sang harmonies so piercing that English besiegers hesitated to attack at dawn, unsettled by the eerie beauty drifting over the battlements. These weren't just displays of artistry, they were psychological warfare, proof that morale couldn't be starved out. Yet the most vital music was the kind never written down, the off-key drinking songs bellowed in barracks, the improvised hymns hummed while sharpening blades. A soldier tapping his dagger against a tin cup might spark an impromptu rhythm, others joining until the whole corridor throbbed with makeshift percussion. These raw, unpolished moments did what no formal composition could. They turned a crowd of desperate individuals into something like a family, because when the final assault came, it wasn't the promise of pay or glory that made men hold the line. It was the memory of their comrade's voice cracking on the chorus the night before, and the unspoken vow that no one would silence it forever. A soldier's cloak might start the siege thick and woolen, dyed in the colors of his lord, but after months of rain, mud, and makeshift repairs, it hung in tatters, more patch than fabric. Every thread became precious. Men unraveled spare tunics to darn holes or scavenged fallen enemies' garments, stitching together Frankenstein-like coats that bore no resemblance to their original finery. Even the humblest scrap of linen could mean the difference between freezing at night or surviving to see dawn. But it wasn't just about warmth. A cloak doubled as a blanket, a bandage, even a makeshift sack for hauling stones to the battlements. When the last frayed edges disintegrated, soldiers rubbed animal fat into their remaining layers to repel rain, the stench of rancid grease clinging to them like a second skin. Mail shirts, those intricate webs of interlocking rings, demanded constant attention. Rust crept in like a silent plague, especially near the coast where salt air gnawed at metal. Soldiers spent hours picking out corroded links with daggers, replacing them with spare rings traded from comrades, a black market of iron and sweat. A single broken link could unravel a whole section under an enemy's axe blow, so men oiled their mail with whatever they had: lard, plant resins, even stolen candle wax. The rhythmic clink of armor maintenance became the soundtrack of siege life, as familiar as the distant thud of trebuchets. Plate armor posed different horrors. A dented breastplate might look imposing, but every crease slowed movement, and a poorly fitted joint could chafe skin raw until infection set in. Blacksmiths became the most sought-after men in the fortress, hammering out dents by firelight or improvising hinges from scrap metal. Gauntlets lined with rotted leather grew stiff as boards, forcing archers to choose between dexterity and protection. Many opted to fight bare-handed rather than miss their shots. Yet no one dared discard their armor entirely, no matter how burdensome. The sight of a sun-bleached tabard flapping over polished steel wasn't just vanity. It sent a message to the enemy: we're still here. We're still ready. Pride in gear survived long after appearances faded. A knight might polish his sword hilt daily, even as his surcoat molded into rags. Foot soldiers carved intricate patterns into their shield grips, not for beauty but to remember the hands that once held them, a father's, a brother's, lost in some earlier battle. These small acts of care were more than routine, they were acts of defiance. When a man's world narrowed to the few feet of wall he was ordered to hold, the weight of his armor became a kind of companionship, its dents and scratches a record of every blow he'd turned aside. To let it crumble was to admit defeat long before the gates fell. And then there were the improvised solutions born of sheer necessity. A broken helmet might be lashed together with leather thongs, its visor permanently fixed open because the hinge was beyond repair. Boot soles worn through to bare feet were reinforced with strips of boiled leather or even folded parchment. Some defenders stuffed their shoes with straw or moss, trading blisters for a whisper of insulation against the cold stone floors. Every adjustment was a gamble. Would this makeshift fix hold during a charge? Would the enemy spot the weakness and strike there? Yet in the calculus of siege survival, a flawed defense was better than none at all. The true test came when the rains poured for weeks, turning storerooms into swamps. Leather straps grew spongy with mildew, sword scabbards sprouted greenish fuzz, and woolens reeked of wet sheep even when dry. Men huddled over smoky fires not for warmth, but to slowly bake moisture from their gear, turning gloves stiff as wood and boots into cracked relics. Yet through it all they adapted. A rusted kneecap might be discarded, but the underlying mail would be reinforced with extra padding. A shattered pauldron could be replaced with layered quilting, stiffened with glue made from boiled animal tendons. Survival wasn't about maintaining standards, it was about redefining them day by grueling day. By the siege's end, a garrison's gear told its own story. A breastplate pocked with arrow strikes, a shield boss hammered back into shape after a dozen blows, a cloak so mended it resembled a patchwork banner. These weren't signs of poverty, but trophies of endurance. When the gates finally opened, whether in victory or surrender, it wasn't the cleanest soldiers who walked out, but those whose gear bore the scars of every battle they'd weathered. And in that moment, even the enemy knew these were no ordinary fighters. They were men who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Nightfall didn't bring rest, it weaponized the imagination. Every scrape of a branch against stone became an enemy grappling hook. Every owl's cry a signal between infiltrators. Sentries stationed along the battlements strained their eyes into the void, their breath shallow as they willed the darkness to take shape. The worst part wasn't the silence, it was the sounds that shouldn't be there. A distant clank of metal, the muffled cough of a man trying not to be heard. These were the triggers that sent hearts racing and fingers tightening around sword hilts. Sleep was a luxury measured in stolen moments rather than hours. Most garrisons rotated in shifts, with soldiers curling up in their armor, their backs against cold stone. The lucky ones had straw pallets or threadbare cloaks to soften the ground, but many simply slumped where they stood, helmets tipped forward to shield their eyes from torchlight. Rest wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. Close your eyes too long, and you might miss the creak of a ladder against the walls. Drift too deep, and the enemy could be inside before your dreams faded. Commanders knew darkness was their weakest hour, so they waged war against exhaustion itself. Some ordered hourly drumbeats to jolt men awake, while others circulated watered wine, just enough to dull the cold but not enough to cloud judgment. A few resorted to brutal pragmatism. Guards caught sleeping might find their hands bound to the hilt of their sword for the next watch, ensuring the pain kept them alert. Yet even discipline couldn't stifle the primal dread that seeped in with the fog. The siege of Stirling Castle saw sentries so jumpy they loosed arrows at their own shadows. only to realize at dawn they'd been shooting at nothing but the wind. And then there were the psychological tortures. Besiegers perfected the art of nighttime terror, flaming arrows arcing into the courtyard at random intervals, or the sudden blare of horns from 3 directions at once. At Chateau de Caussy, attackers tied lanterns to stray dogs, sending the panicked animals scrambling toward the walls in a grotesque mimicry of an advancing army. Defenders wasted precious arrows cutting them down, only to face the real assault at sunrise with quivers near empty. These weren't just tactics, they were calculated acts of cruelty designed to erode sanity itself. Yet in this oppressive gloom, humanity found its strangest resilience. Soldiers whispered jokes about the enemy's incompetence, turning fear into laughter. Others sang softly, not the bawdy tavern tunes of daylight, but lullabies from childhood, their voices threading through the dark like fragile ropes thrown to drowning men. The most hardened knights might admit their terrors to a teenager on first watch, passing down not just duty but the unspoken truth. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand despite it. Dawn was both relief and reckoning. As the first grey light seeped over the horizon, men rubbed grit from their eyes and took stock. Had the night's alarms been real threats or phantoms? Were the missing sentries deserters or corpses? The answers didn't matter as much as the simple fact that they'd survived another darkness. Because in the end, night sieges weren't about battles. They were about outlasting the worst parts of yourself, hour by trembling hour, until the sun gave you permission to be brave again. The stench of sewage clung to the escapee's clothes as he waded through the pitch-black tunnel, his fingers scraping against slime-covered bricks. Above him, the fortress slept, or pretended to. Every guard post, every torch-lit corridor held the potential for discovery, but the alternative was worse. To stay meant starvation, disease, or a slow death, watching comrades turn hollow-eyed with despair. So he moved, inch by agonizing inch, through the castle's bowels, praying the labyrinth of waste channels would spit him out beyond enemy lines. Few made it. Most were dragged back, their bodies broken by the fall from a rope cut too soon, or their disguises unraveled by a suspicious sentry's dagger point. But the desperate kept trying, because a slim chance was better than none at all. Desertion wasn't just an act of cowardice, it was a complex calculus of survival. A father might abandon his post to smuggle food to his children in the starving town below. A conscripted farmer, forced into service, could justify fleeing as a return to the land that needed him. Even veteran soldiers cracked under the weight of endless vigilance, their loyalty eroded by empty promises of relief. The methods were as varied as the men who attempted them. Some slipped into the robes of monks visiting to administer last rites, their shaved heads and muttered Latin buying passage past drowsy guards. Others bribed gravediggers to hide them among corpses hauled beyond the walls, though the risk of being buried alive was grimly real. The penalties were designed to terrify. Captured deserters faced more than execution. Their deaths were spectacles. A man might be sealed into a barrel studded with spikes and rolled down the castle's steepest stairwell, his screams echoing through the halls as a lesson. Others were hung in chains from the battlements, left to twist in the wind until their bones picked clean by crows. Yet paradoxically, the very brutality of these punishments sometimes backfired. At the siege of Rouen, a garrison already teetering on mutiny watched their comrades drawn out flogging, and by dawn 12 more had vanished into the fog. What's often overlooked is the role of luck in these escapes. A sudden rainstorm could drown out the clatter of a dropped dagger. A distracted enemy sentry, more concerned with his chilblains than his watch, might miss the shadow darting through the postern gate. The siege of Antioch saw 2 knights escape by floating down river under a cloak of fog, their armor strapped to logs to keep them afloat, but for every stroke of fortune there were 100 failures. The chronicles are full of unnamed men who almost made it, their skeletons later found wedged in tunnels or their footprints ending abruptly at the moat's edge. The true cost of desertion wasn't just measured in nooses or severed heads. It frayed the fragile trust holding garrisons together. Commanders quietly doubled watches on supply rooms, knowing a single stolen key could doom them. Soldiers eyed their comrades with new suspicion, wondering who might slit their throat for a crust of bread and a head start into the dark. Yet even in this atmosphere of dread, some escapes became legends. The baker's apprentice who talked his way into the enemy camp by offering to betray his lord, only to lead a relief force back through secret passages. The wounded archer who crawled through a mile of brambles to bring word of a vulnerable flank. Their stories, rare as they were, proved that sometimes the greatest act of defiance wasn't holding the line, it was slipping through it. Legends cling to the stones of besieged castles like moss, whispering stories no history book dares tell. Take the ghostly sentinel of Chateau de Coucy, said to pace the battlements every winter solstice, a French soldier who refused to abandon his post even in death after the fortress fell in 1417. Locals claim his hollow-eyed stare still tracks visitors, his rusted halberd raised against invaders long turned to dust. Such tales aren't just campfire fodder, they're psychological scars dressed in folklore's garb. When a community endures months of starvation and slaughter, the mind stitches together explanations for the unexplainable. Why does the well water still taste of iron centuries later? The cursed blood of betrayed defenders, the story goes. Why do ravens nest only on the fortress's north side? They feast on the unburied dead from the final assault. The most enduring siege legends twist victory into poetic justice. After the brutal sack of Limoges, rumors spread that Edward the Black Prince's warhorse collapsed beneath him as he entered the city, a divine rebuke for his mercilessness. In reality, the prince suffered from chronic illness, but folklore preferred a moral lesson. Similarly, Ottoman accounts of Constantinople's fall speak of priests vanishing into the Hagia Sophia's walls, their chants still audible on certain nights. These narratives gave the defeated a spectral revenge, ensuring conquerors never fully possessed what they'd taken. Some legends served practical purposes long after the siege ended. The Curse of Harlech warned children away from its crumbling towers by claiming the ghosts of Welsh archers shot stones at trespassers, a handy deterrent in an era before safety railings. At Carcassonne, the tale of Dame Carcass supposedly outwitting Charlemagne's army by feeding their last pig to the enemy, then sounding victory bells when they misinterpreted its gluttony as abundance wasn't just entertainment. It encoded survival tactics, deception, rationing, and the power of morale. What makes these stories so haunting isn't their fantastical elements, but the raw humanity beneath them. The Weeping Woman said to Rome's Stirling Castle's vaults, she mirrors real accounts of noblewomen plunging from towers to avoid capture. The Phantom Banquet at Roquefixade, where spectral revelers eternally toast with empty cups. A direct echo of defenders who staged feasts with hollow trenchers to fake abundance. These myths are collective memory in metaphor, a way to process trauma too vast for straightforward telling. And then there are the silent legends, the ones not spoken aloud. In the Pyrenees, shepherds still avoid a certain hillock near Montségur, though none can say why. Perhaps it's the way the wind sounds like distant screams when it gusts just right, or the stubborn fact that no flowers grow there, though the soil is rich. Some truths don't need ghost stories, the land itself remembers. long after the last arrowhead is dug up and the final chronicle yellowed to dust, the stones keep their secrets. And sometimes, if you listen closely, they whisper. The daily life of a besieged soldier was never just about battles and bloodshed. It was a relentless test of the human spirit, woven from moments of crushing despair and sparks of unexpected grace. Picture a man who could recite every saint's feast day by heart, yet hadn't tasted fresh bread in months. A knight who'd once jousted for glory now bartered his last silver spur for a handful of moldy grain. These weren't just warriors, they were fathers, sons, and brothers trapped in a nightmare where hunger gnawed as fiercely as fear, and survival demanded more than strength, it demanded creativity. They patched armor with leather stolen from abandoned boots, turned chapel vestments into bandages, and whispered rumors of imaginary relief armies just to keep hope flickering. Every day was a high-wire act between discipline and mutiny, faith and superstition, with the abyss yawning beneath them. What makes their stories so unforgettable isn't the grand strategies or the clashing of swords, but the fragile humanity that persisted in the cracks. A shared drink from a stolen wineskin during a midnight watch, the way soldiers passed around a single tattered prayer book until the pages softened with sweat and grime. Even in the darkest hours, they found ways to remind each other they were still alive, scratching jokes onto the castle walls, trading childhood stories in the dark, or tenderly wrapping a dying comrade's hands around a makeshift cross. These weren't acts of heroism, they were acts of defiance against the dehumanizing grind of siege warfare. Their legacy reshapes how we view medieval conflict. We often imagine wars as sweeping campaigns decided on open fields, but sieges were the slow, suffocating reality, a war of inches and attrition, where the real enemy was often time itself. The innovations born from desperation still astonish. Hidden aqueducts rerouted to foil poisoners, psychological warfare using nothing but shadows and noise, medical treatments stumbled upon through trial and harrowing error. These soldiers didn't just endure, they adapted, leaving behind a playbook of survival that would echo through centuries of warfare. Yet the true lesson isn't in their tactics, but in their resilience. When we read about sieges in history books, it's easy to reduce them to dates and casualty numbers. But behind those walls were individuals who chose, again and again, to face another dawn, not because they believed in victory, but because they refused to let the light go out. That stubborn flicker of hope, more than any sword or shield, is what truly held the line. If these stories resonated with you, let's keep the conversation alive. Drop a comment below about which siege detail surprised you most. Was it the pigeon messengers, the hidden gardens, or the eerie power of music in the dark? And if you're hungry for more untold histories, hit that subscribe button. Together, we'll keep pulling back the curtain on the past, one extraordinary story at a time.